what I love the most about it wasn't even like sharing the episode at the end of it. It was the whole process of like finding the guest, recording, editing, like figuring out like the whole business side of it. Like I can even remember going to sunbiz.org because I'm in Florida, where you register your business, like your LLC, right? And like thoroughly enjoying that. Most people are like, I don't want to do that, but I was like, cool, I got to have a bank account, like just in case I bring in some affiliate commission, like setting all up, talking to my CPA. Yeah, I look back now and like, yeah, sure, I was just starting a podcast. But now that I look back, I'm like, I was starting a business. Like that was a practice for what my future was going to look like.
Podcast Junkies 261, welcome back after a bit of a hiatus. I'm your host, Harry Turan. If you are new to the show, this is the one where we seek out interesting voices in podcasting and get them to talk about their shows and whatever else is coming up for them. In case you missed last episode, we had a great conversation with Sue Stockdale, host of Access to Inspiration. I was able to get a bit of a recharge over the past week as my partner and I did a little bit of traveling across the country and got to visit Colorado, Nebraska, and South Dakota for a much needed reboot and connection with nature. So if you're not doing that or have those planned this summer, please make sure it's super important, health, mentally and physically wise. This week, I speak to a friend of the show, Alex Sanfilippo. He's a founder of a company called PodMatch and also the host of Creating a Brand. As an entrepreneur and a podcaster, he joined us this week to discuss all the good things he's doing in the world of podcasting. In addition to the host of Creating a Brand, which is the top 20 entrepreneurship podcast, Alex's goal is to help individuals grow faster personally and professionally. In this episode, we talk about his entrepreneurial journey, how launching a podcast was critical to preparing him to start his business. And Alex also opens up about his growth as a podcast host and the wealth of knowledge he's gained from the guests he's had on the show. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite, and the link will be in the show notes as well. We have a nice heart-to-heart as we talked about core values and what he loves most about podcasting as a medium, and also what excites him about his latest project, PodMatch, which is providing a valuable resource for the podcasting community. Really love this conversation with Alex, and I think you will too. As always, full show notes, any resources mentioned, available at podcastjunkies.com/261. If you want to support the show, go ahead and leave us a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. Make sure you stay to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. But now let's get into this conversation with Alex. Alex Sanfilippo, host of Creating a Brand and founder of PodMatch. Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Yeah, Harry, really glad to be here, man. Thanks so much for having me.
So much to talk about. It feels like
a lot. We were already talking before we hit record. We had to stop. So here we are.
Yeah. And for the benefit of the listener, I've known about Alex for, is it almost a year? Maybe I
think it's getting pretty close. Yeah. It's probably 9-10 months at this point, I think.
Yeah. And then I think you came across my radar with the work you were doing around PodMatch. And then we is usually the case with me and my OCD tendencies. I had tons of feedback. This is great, but
you've been really helpful for all the listeners that have been with Harry for a long time. You probably noticed about him. He loves to help. And so like the first time we had a call, it was probably like 45 minutes. I'm like, hey man, I tried to get 15 minutes of your time. You give me 45. I'm like, I wasn't trying to like take advantage of your time. You're like, no. Here's 20 things you need to go look at. So the first call, the second call was about 2 months where I was just like going through all these resources and stuff, but super helpful, man. As a first time founder of a SaaS company, software as a service, you've been a great guide along the way. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think what I like about you, and we can talk a little bit about your background, so it's probably going to be no surprise, but you were really consistent in terms of like the notes and how you turn that into actionable steps.
Right.
So we can have that as a jumping off point before you started the company, and let us know about the timing with the podcast. But you had a previous career in a completely unrelated industry.
Yeah. To dive into that career, it was 15 years actually, and it was in the aerospace industry. I should give the disclaimer, I wasn't an astronaut, a fighter pilot, or a skydiver. And that's like the popular belief. When I say aerospace, people are like, oh my gosh, like this guy has been to the moon. It's
Well, you can
definitely
just
not
stop it
happening.
there. Like when people say that, say like I'm in aerospace, and just like and then go get a drink or something like
I
that.
really, you know what I should do? I should be like, it's classified. I can't really talk about it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Why
Well,
not?
truth of the matter, I was behind a computer and I was running a commercial operations division. So I oversaw 5 departments. My job was profit margins and processes, making sure we're making money and we're doing so efficiently. And I loved it, but that's what I was doing, not going to the moon. So
Well, for someone who was going to end up starting their own company, a focus on profits and processes is probably a good skill you learned.
yeah, I'm so thankful for it. And leaving that job after 15 years was bittersweet. I think a lot of people, when they think, like I'm an entrepreneur at heart, always have been, when they think leaving a 9 to 5, they're like, oh, that had to feel so good. And honestly, like it was nice because I had created something for myself that was showing the potential to replace that salary. But leaving was a tough decision. Like the last day I left, I was sad to walk out of that building. But I am very thankful for the skills I developed during that time, the education they brought me. I've had education that I would have never been able to afford on my own. And the company was always helping me grow and develop further. When I got started, I didn't start as that commercial operations director. I started as a part-time receiving guy, which is translation for breaking down boxes and taking out people's trash for them, Like, so it was over many years that I was able to
Yeah.
to work my way up to that. But I'm so thankful for that time. It was very beneficial for me.
So how did you end up in that industry? Is that something you were always passionate about in school? Did you like science? Did you like math?
No, I didn't like any of that stuff, man. What I really liked doing was building something. Like I just enjoyed the act of doing that, learning something new, always being challenged. And actually what got me there is it was right around the time the economy was tanking. And I had some investment properties and stuff like that. And obviously that just wasn't going to be a good business at that point, especially for someone so young. I was really young, late teens, early 20s when I started getting properties. And I thought it was really cool at 18 buying a property without a cosign. But now I realize my dog could have bought a property by itself. So, but after that tank, it was like, no, you don't have $1 million in the bank. You can't buy anything anymore. Anyway, so that's when I got into aerospace. And thankfully, my dad was in aerospace. He's actually still his day. He still works in the aerospace industry. And having that name, Andy Sanfilippo, behind my last name really helped a lot. So I was able to get an interview and get a part-time job to kind of work my way into the company. So that was a pretty cool thing.
What was it like growing up with your father working in the aerospace industry?
Yeah, it was honestly really cool. My dad's always been a big inspiration. When I was young, he worked a lot. He was building businesses and things like that. And he is so talented. He has like the mind of an engineer, but he's not like technically an engineer, like, but he has that mind. And I've always been really inspired by him. He's always really been helpful. Even I actually was seeking his counsel when I was planning on leaving the aerospace industry. Like after all those years, I was like, hey, dad, like you got me this job. You helped me like along the way. Like without him, I wouldn't have been where I was. And I was like, what do you think of this? And he's like, oh, now's the best time for you to do that. He's like, you should definitely go for it. He goes, what's the worst that could happen? You have to go get another job somewhere. I'm like, good point, man. Like, yeah, like, but I wanted to have that call with him before I made a decision, but really helpful the whole way through. I mean, I had a great relationship with my dad growing up. Couldn't be more thankful for that because not everybody has that. So it's something that I still today cherish.
Yeah, you mentioned he wasn't an engineer by trade and that you mentioned he was building businesses. So is that part of where you got the entrepreneurial like idea, the inspiration, the bug, or just seeing that that was something that's possible?
Yeah, I think that just kind of growing up with that mindset, yeah, I think I really got it from there. I mean, when I was a kid, I was selling used golf balls to the golfers across the street. I'd go dig the golf balls out of the lakes. That was me when I was 10 and 12, like 10 to 12 years old. After that, you're not cute anymore. So can't get away with it. And they're like, give me that ball back, kid. But when you're between 10 and 12, they're like, I'll give you $3 for a Pro V1 golf ball, right? So yeah, like I was doing a bit of that even as a kid and just remember really enjoying it. And I found different things throughout high school. And my dad was always, again, really supportive. Whenever I was doing that, he was like, oh, that's so cool. Like, really great idea. Really cool here, really cool there. Right. Like, and he was just kind of sharing that type of thing. So I think it was just kind of, I was brought up in it, if you will. But I, at the same time, had no problem working for an organization. I mean, I don't think that they would say anything negative about me being like, wow, Alex was too much of a free spirit in the job. Right. Like, I understood the authority and the processes and things like that as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it gave you both perspectives, having that hustle from early on, digging those golf balls out of the lake,
Yeah.
and knowing and the fact that you were able to rattle off like the actual like mark of it and knew what the values of a golf ball like that would be is hilarious too. But then the discipline and the processes that come into play when you're working in a company. especially something in, I imagine aerospace is an industry where they run a pretty tight ship there. And so like it's very obvious if folks are not pulling their weight, things are not getting done on time. So it's nice to sort of have both aspects of the importance of building a business.
Yeah, man, you couldn't have said it better. It's so true. Like it's really technical there. So like there are certain spots in the floor you couldn't even walk. Like there was tape around the floors when you're in the shop and things like that. And there's just no room for error. But we had a lot of processes in place to make sure that we wouldn't be making mistakes, right? There's a lot of people who rechecking things and it gets a little tedious for sure. But again, it was a job that I loved and it taught me the importance of quality, not perfection, but quality. And I've carried that with me throughout starting a podcast, starting a business now. It's been very beneficial. Again, without doing those 15 years, and if I tried to start this without that, I don't know what would have happened already, but probably not the outcome I've already seen. That's for sure.
You said something that really caught my attention. You said it's quality, not perfection. And I've expressed it before as perfect is the enemy of done. But is that something that they actively talked about, or was that just understood that look, as long as you're doing the best you can, you won't always get it perfect, but as long as you at least take pride in what you put out there, you'll be fine?
No, actually, they more so drove a perfectionist mindset, if anything else, because there's just again, there's no room. You think if this stuff that we're building was going on airplanes, like
Yeah,
it's not going to park on a cloud and be like something's wrong. How can we
yeah,
troubleshoot?
yeah,
Like it
yeah,
falls out
yeah,
of the sky if there's a problem. So it
yeah.
was more so perfection was driven into all of us. So for me, I had to learn that balance because I remember for a few years that job when I started getting higher up in positions, I started struggling with stress like really
Mm,
bad. Like dude, I started losing my hair in my mid 20s. And like, it's funny now I'm like in my early 30s, maybe mid 33. I don't know what that number actually is, but I have more hair now than I did 8 years ago because like
wow.
I learned to manage that stress of like, okay, Alex, perfect won't happen, but I can just do my best to do what I'm doing with excellence and feel proud for letting this go. And that came through a lot of reading, a lot of listening to podcasts and things like that, just things to really like help me get that correct mindset. And instead of the big corporate mandate that felt like perfection is what we're after, right?
Yeah, I think people take for granted the amount of rigor and discipline that goes into something that comes out of like aerospace industries where you build stuff. And if you don't build it right, like people can die.
Right. Yeah.
It's crazy. You mentioned podcasts now. So is that around the time you were thinking of starting your own? Like, where did that seed sprout?
Yeah. So actually, what made me decide to start podcasting, first off, I love podcasts, like listening to them. So I'm like, you know what? I haven't really quite found what I wanted in a podcast necessarily. So I was like, I'm going to go ahead and make one. Sound like something that was fun to do. And around this time is when that company I was working for went public. So it went from a private company where I could make a decision for any one of my 5 departments, and a week later we could be doing it, to now we have a board of directors, we have shareholders, it's a multi-billion-dollar company now. Like it
Oh,
changed a lot really quick. And it was running actually probably even better. However, when I had an idea, it was 6 months to implementation now because it has to go to a board, it has to go to shareholders, it has to determine how this is going to happen, right? So there was so many things that happened during that time that made me realize that I was kind of not feeling like an entrepreneur anymore because my decisions couldn't be made as quick as they could previously. So that's what made me decide to start a podcast. It was like the side hustle to kind of, I guess, scratch that itch, if you will, of like doing something that I felt like I was actually creating in real time and could leave an impact with. So that's why I decided to start it, because like, you know what? It wasn't like I'm trying to leave. It was more so like I just need to somehow feel like I'm still an entrepreneur because right now I'm in big corporate and that's the way all companies go. I mean, if they do well, they're going to get there. And that's okay as long as you have something on the side. So I really started that podcast with no intent of leaving that job anytime soon.
what point did you start mentioning to people at work that you had a podcast, or did someone eventually just find out?
I was actually I shared it like with everybody I could, but I was nervous to tell people at work. And because the misconception of podcasting is that I'm going to start one and 6 months later, I'm going to be making $1 million a month off of advertisements and I'm going to quit
Yeah,
my
yeah,
job,
yeah.
right? Like
Of course.
that's a very common misconception that
You
you've
mean that hasn't happened?
no, no, of course not. Anyway, I digress with that. But a couple weeks after I launched, I started like telling a few people that had a podcast. I tried to keep it like down low, but like then it spread like a wildfire. And I remember my CEO, I'd only been working for him for like a year and a half, and he like walked up to my desk and was like, "Hey," I was like, "Hi." He's like, "I really like your podcast. It's really good." I was like sweating. I'm like, What's he gonna say next? That was all he had to say. He's like, it was really good. He specifically called out an episode that he's like, yeah, I actually learned a lot from this guy that you had on. And I was like,
Oh, that's
and then he
cool.
just walked away. I was like, okay, like, all right. But anyway, after that, it was kind of everyone talked about it and stuff. And regular people were like, oh, I saw you had this guest and you had this person. So it became a fun thing among me and my team because again, that shock initially of like, oh my gosh, is he trying to leave? Wasn't there anymore. It was more like, this is just something Alex does for fun. The rest of us, we go to bars and go play golf, and Alex
Yeah.
does podcasts, So it was just kind of one of those things that was fine after it kind of settled a little bit.
How did you decide on the premise, what you were going to talk about, the topic, all that stuff?
Yeah. So for me, again, being in that corporate environment, I didn't have a ton of time, and podcasts were one of my primary places and ways to learn. So what I realized was missing is I couldn't find many shows. And disclaimer here to your listeners, most people don't like this kind of show I'm about to describe. Like it's not super popular. But I wanted something that was more like a keynote or a masterclass, if you will. So it's just straight to the point information. So when I bring on a guest to talk about, I don't know, public speaking, they're going to give us 5 steps for public speaking and how they've been able to grow their practice with that. And there's no like, where'd you go to school? Where did you learn this? Were you nervous? It's just like, give us 5 things we can do and let's get like from start to finish. So they tend to be shorter episodes, but it's very action packed. And I always recommend people have a notepad with you, like have your notepad on your phone or something that you can write on because it's going to be a lot of information really quick if it's something that you want. So the idea is early entrepreneurs, helping them make that first or next step in their business the right one. And I just bring on people to talk about things that will help them do just that. And it's very focused. And I developed that because that's what I wanted. I saw that was something that seemed to be missing. And I wanted to somehow add that value that I couldn't find. And I'm sure it's out there. I can't be the only person doing this. I could probably find 100 of them by now because I know how to search through podcasts better and there's better apps for it. But at that point, it was just something that I was like, you know what? I'm not seeing this. I would love to be able to do this.
Did you think, looking back now, that maybe there was part of you that was starting that because you want to learn what it takes to build a business or to be successful building a business? Because I think there was some part of you that there was that seed in you that says like, oh, I may give this another try and, why not learn along the way?
Yeah, I mean, you're right on it, man. Like, it's funny. I look back now and I think what I love the most about it wasn't even like sharing the episode at the end of it. It was the whole process of like finding the guest, recording, editing, like figuring out like the whole business side of it. Like I can even remember going to sunbiz.org because I'm in Florida where you register your business, like your LLC, right? And like thoroughly enjoying that. Most people are like, I don't want to do that, but I was like, cool, I got to have a bank account, like just in case I bring in some affiliate commission, like setting all up, talking to my CPA. Yeah, I look back now and like, yeah, sure, I was just starting a podcast. But now that I look back, I'm like, I was starting a business. Like that was a practice for what my future was going to look like. And yeah, it was an important moment for me and something that I'll always look back and really cherish. Like I love doing my podcast still this day. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, it definitely kind of set me off on a course that maybe I didn't expect. But yeah, you're insightful enough to see that, I think. So
I can't help but think of that cartoon with the baby and he's wearing a suit. What is that? The baby billionaire or billionaire baby? What's it called?
I don't
You've
know.
seen
I
it,
know
right?
exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
That was you.
it
That
probably
was you.
was.
Like you probably had like a little briefcase when you were younger instead of like, cowboys and Indians. You were playing like, let's go to the office or something like that.
My mom tells me I used to have it was a little lunchbox, but like I emptied it out and pulled all the compartments out. And she said I put all my little toy airplanes in it. I always loved airplanes even as a kid. So she said I just pack it full of like all these little airplanes and I carried everywhere I went. So I guess so. Probably was
The
me.
aerospace
Yeah.
industry, it's all coming together, man.
You would have thought my podcast would have been about something aviation related. It was not. So
Did you see recently saw Leonardo DiCaprio, Catch Me If You Can? Have you seen that with Tom Hanks?
no, I've never seen that.
Oh, it's really good. It's it's an actual true story of this guy who just basically he was a con man and he would just con people and he was able to convince people that he was a pilot and then he walked onto this is in the 70s so it's a little easier to do but he's like
Right.
eventually like makes it onto a plane and he's sitting in like the jump seat because he just put the suit on because he went to where like American Airlines had their uniforms made and he had a uniform made and he was able to like he didn't actually ever fly I think but he was just letting people know pretending he was like an airplane pilot that's
What?
just one of the things he did you got
I
to see
never
it.
did that. Oh. But oh my gosh, that sounds so
No, but it's
scary.
interesting because it's the power of like probably using some like NLP techniques or something like that. Just like literally how to like you start out with a little stuff and he was just like you could tell he's really smart, but just kind of like that if only he would use that power for good instead of like trying to con
Right.
people. So
Very persuasive. Like
yeah.
something that's obviously that person had something that was likable about them. Because if you're a jerk,
Yes,
people are just
yes.
gonna be like, I don't
Very
care if you're a pilot,
likable.
you're not getting on this plane. But
Yeah.
obviously, like people are just like, oh, this guy's
Yeah.
great. Of course he's a
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
pilot,
Yeah.
right?
Totally. Totally. Like you make them feel bad for not inviting you to like the stuff that you want them to do,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, what are some highlights from going through that experience? And like, how many episodes are you up to now?
Right now, I'm at 94 that are published right now when we're having this conversation, but I've got more than 100 in the queue, or I shouldn't say that. I have more than 10 more in the
Oh,
queue,
yeah.
which will put me over 100 episodes. I don't have 100 to go. That would be crazy.
Not that the listener would be surprised if you did say that. Yeah, I've got 100 more. Yeah, just to that question, how do you feel you've evolved as a host since then?
Yeah, I think that when I first got started, I struggled to find guests like most people would, right? Like your first 6 months especially, it's very tough. And I just didn't know exactly who I was looking for. Like now I understand my why more, who my ideal listener is. Like I've learned those people a lot better. And along the way for me as a host, I've learned to communicate to those people better. So when I'm talking to somebody like you, Harry, I know how to be like, okay, I know which part of Harry's story is going to relate the best. And I want to make sure that I bring that out. And I do that through a lot of research. When I first got started, if you're going to be on my show, I wasn't going to read your book. And a lot of people still don't do this. But now, if you have a book and we're going to talk about it, I read the whole thing beforehand. So I put in about 30 hours of research before I'll interview a guest. And I like to be really prepared. Again, I like to know that I can bring up certain topics that this person is going to know really well and be able to articulate clearly that will really help somebody. And that's taken a lot of development. So learning to listen and ask great questions that are really on point for my listener are just some things I've gotten better and better at. And I hope I continue to get better at that. I definitely put my all into that. It's very important that the episode that's produced is top quality for my guest, my listener, right? I want it to be good for both of those people. I don't actually do a lot of editing, and it's usually because it goes in a good direction. Like I know you don't do a lot of editing either. It's just if you bring on the right people and you have the right conversations, you don't necessarily need to pull out 30 and 40 minutes of it. I guess unless you get a talker. So
Yeah, it's a good point because it's something that I'm actively aware of. Like as we're having conversation, if I'm intently paying attention to what you're saying, you can sometimes predict when a person is wrapping up a thought, and in a way, it helps you figure out like, okay, do I want to continue that thought? Did they say something that was interesting? So all this is some sort of like happening in my brain. But I think to your point, that's why I don't tend to not do a lot of editing because I'm already conscious of any potential like dead air,
right.
as it, and just from experience, again, from having done like, over 258, 60, 70 episodes, just, understanding the nuances of like when people pause, sometimes it's just because they need to think about their answer and they need to say, do I want to give the correct answer or the answer that I've never told anyone?
Right.
And sometimes I feel like it's space and it contracts and expands. And if as you let it expand, when you sort of feeling that you have the right guest who's feeling like comfortable and, in a flow, then that's something you definitely don't want to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's a good point that you bring up there. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to mention this just because you being a host, like, and at this point, many of your listeners, they've been with you for a long time now. It's a lot. It can be a lot of pressure. Like, it's a little bit draining. The most interviews I've ever done in one day is 3, and I don't know as I can do more than that. Like, I
That's a
obviously
lot.
like I take a 3-week break beforehand to take a week to research each of them, but by the end of it, I'm really drained because as the host sitting on your side of the mic right now, it's a lot more pressure because you're like, okay, where's he going with this? How can I tie this back to something that my listeners care about if it goes off track, right? Like there's a lot more going on your side. You're just telling me to talk about who I am, which for a lot of us is pretty simple. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but yeah, so it can be it can be draining. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of fun. I believe it all pays off, but there's a lot to being on the host side of a mic, a lot more than people give it credit for. Let's put it that way if you're going to do it well.
Yeah, especially when you mentioned doing 30 hours of research on a guest and then you sometimes feel like, well, I got to get some of these questions in. So sometimes that's a challenge because I'm probably on the opposite end of the spectrum where I know enough to know where I want the conversation to go. But then like I've said to people before, it's the listener learning about you. Sometimes at the same time I do as well.
Yeah.
So it's if I don't know something, I'll just ask you and pull apart the threads that interest me and hopefully, if you're listening to the show, then they'll interest you as well. So,
But that's like you ask good questions and you listen really well. I'm not saying I'm bad at those things, but the way that I've made my podcast, again, being like very actionable, practical information that's really fast. I don't have a lot of room in there, right? Like, so it's very pointed questions that have like a specific answer that is actionable. So doing it that way, I think, is why I do this research. A person who does it the way you do it more so is John Lee Dumas, like one of the biggest podcasts out there, right? He says he doesn't even look up most of those people, other than the fact to make sure that they're going to be a good guest, right? That's about as far as he goes. He prefers to know nothing, but he's a great listener and asks really powerful questions that make for a good episode every time. Similar to how you do it. You do the same thing. You ask really great questions. You keep a good conversation going. So it's just a matter of preference. And maybe I don't have enough faith in myself to ask good questions if I don't know all this stuff already. I don't know. But this is the way I do it, and it works really well for me.
I think for you, it might have to be a separate show. So, because you would, I think if you have a certain level of quality that you've had in the show up until this point because of the preparation, because how much time you put into it, I don't know that you could switch gears for this
Right.
specific show and just because you'd feel like, oh man, I'm not living up to like the quality that the previous shows had. So, if you
Right.
want to call it creating a brand after dark or something like that. So,
I think one show along with my company is enough for me right
yeah.
now, Harry. I think I'm good.
And is there a memorable connection you made or a conversation you had? Because once you get to close to 100, you do start to end up speaking to some interesting folks.
Yeah. So from like my guest standpoint, right? You're talking about the people who've been on the show. Yeah,
Yeah.
man, I've had just some really cool connections and people I've been able to meet. I could go in 100 different directions here, but like one I'd say that has been really great is Scott Miller. I think you might know Scott, I believe. Maybe Scott Miller. He's the
Franklin
former,
Covey.
yeah, Frank, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
former CMO of Franklin Covey Co. Now he's an advisor. He runs their On Leadership podcast, but he's just been a great guy along the way. Like I've had him on the show twice now. The first one on the show was very early on. Like I think he was my 30th episode where I was still super nervous. I did read his book beforehand, so I did that much. But since that time, he's kept up with me via text. He always messaged me and stuff like that. And anytime we get on a call, he's always like, "Hey man, I love watching your journey." He goes, I stay up with everything you're doing. And this guy's like high strung,
That's
super
so
fast
cool.
paced. And
Yeah.
last time I was on a call with him, he's like, "All right, I gotta go." He's like, "I have a call with Bill Gates in a few minutes." And I was like, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, he's an old friend." And then just hangs up. I'm like, Bill Gates is an old friend of yours. What are you talking about?
That's
Like,
so funny.
but anyway, so and he's just been a great mentor for me along the way as well from a leadership standpoint. Like that's been his craft all along. So that's one. I could mention 10 or 20 others, but it's just been really great to build relationships with some people that I never thought I'd meet or have the opportunity to collaborate with, if you will.
Yeah. And so for listeners, Scott was on Podcast Junkies episode 230, and that was a good conversation. I think he's scheduled for a follow up as well because I think he does have the new book out. So
Yeah, yeah, it sure does. That's cool.
yeah, it's really nice.
He's fast paced, by the way.
Yeah, he
I need
is.
very for him. I actually like the second time I brought him on, I already know his personality. I prepped. I read the book, so I did do that. But then, other than that, I prepped for maybe 30 minutes when I'd usually do another 10 hours with somebody else. I just know how he is. He comes on, he knows his content. He is
Oh
ready
yeah.
to go from 1 to 5, like ready to go. Like,
That yeah, it'd be interesting to. You probably don't want to 2x that episode between you and Scott because I imagine you guys are already going
oh yeah, for
at that
sure.
pace.
Yes, it got really loud.
That's hilarious. So it's funny. Do you ever have to explain to people like outside of podcasting, like what you do, or like that you talked about that benefit of like meeting through a podcast, like how powerful it is as a vehicle? Because, like you said, I look forward to these conversations because I get an hour, and when I'm done, I'm like, higher vibe than I was before because, like,
Yeah.
I've had people on that make me happy and make me love to talk about the thing that I love to talk about. And so I'm wondering, that seems common for us in podcasting, but do you ever try to like explain what the experience is like to anyone outside of podcasting?
I'll mention a couple, but the first one will be really brief here. My grandfather, I was taking him to my dad's house. We were going over for like a dinner, and me and my wife and him were in the car. And he's like, "What are you doing for work these days?" And I was like, "Oh, I have a podcast." And he goes, he's 94. And he goes, "What?" I was like, "A podcast." He goes, "What's that?" And like I started explaining it to him. And then he just was like staring at me like while I'm driving, just not getting it. And my wife goes, "It's basically like a radio show." He goes, "Oh, is it on AM or FM?" And and that's how the conversation went with him. And finally, I was like, I'm working my way to those. I'm like, it's just not there yet. And he's like, "Oh, okay." And that was
You
that
should have
was the
said
first
you
of my.
should have said XM.
I should. I don't know if you would have gotten it though, man. I have no idea. Funny. One time I was in the printed newspaper, which I didn't even know was a thing, and he got it and like cut out a copy of it and framed it and gave it to me. Like I was online and like I didn't know that it was us. It was in like the Florida Times,
Yeah.
and it was also like in their actual newspaper. And he was like so proud of that moment. And I was like, oh, I saw this online. He's like, didn't understand that either. He's like, what are you talking about? You saw it online and I have it right here. But anyway, so that's like one side of it. But yeah, like anytime I meet people, like I do my best to ask or to mention what I do and then ask if they understand it. Because a lot of people, I'm surprised how many people still don't understand podcasting. Like I'd say one out of, maybe this is with along with the stats, 1 out of 3 people I tell don't really know what a podcast is or have never listened to one. So like
Yeah.
people are like, oh, well, can you explain it? Like, what does that mean? So yeah, I've had to like really bring it down to what I do. And I have like my very short elevator pitch, I guess you can call it. But I actually really enjoy doing that because then I can also gauge like what people do. Like instead of like, where do you get your education from? And I find most of those people are like, oh, I got to school 8 years ago. I don't want anything to do with education anymore, right? Or like personal development, I'm out. So those are usually people who don't know what a podcast is or don't want to listen to one.
What is the elevator pitch?
So I go into the same thing, like I'm a podcast host and I focus on people that are early in their entrepreneurial journey. I help make that first or next step in their business the right one by giving them practical steps to make a decision that they need to make. And I do this by bringing on subject matter experts and thought leaders on topics that, again, matter to those entrepreneurs that are early in their journey.
Boom. That sounds like
I've said it a few times.
pretty.
I don't like saying it like on a podcast because it just sounds so like robotic, but I dress it up, I promise.
Yeah. That's so funny because it's helpful because you have to, it feels like you've kept adding to it as you've had to explain different parts of what it is you do.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so you've got the podcast now. You're getting inspired by all these people that you're having conversations with. You're no doubt starting to meet other people in the podcasting community. You've already demonstrated that you have the entrepreneurial bug. So tell me how all these now pieces are starting to coalesce into what will become PodMatch.
Yeah. So, if I could go back to the beginning of when I started my podcast, I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know anything about podcasting. Like, I had no clue what I was doing. So, I just reached out to random people to help. So, people that I saw had a podcast, and I fully expected them to be like, no, because I'm already in the entrepreneurship space, because I come from big corporate aerospace, very competitive, very, very competitive. So, when I started, I'm like, great, these people aren't going to want to help me because they have an entrepreneurship podcast. They're going to be afraid I'm going to take their listeners, right? Like, that was my initial mindset and thought behind it. But as I met these people, they didn't care. As a matter of fact, they're like, oh, I'll share you my email list. Maybe some people who listen to my podcast will also listen to yours. And I was like, what is this? Like, what is going on here? And I just realized so fast how kind, in general, podcasters are. And maybe I just got around the right people, but everyone I've met, I mean, you're
Oh,
another
yeah.
example of that. Like, we've had so many calls and I have never given you a dime. I don't know if I'm going to get a bill one day, but as of right now, I feel like you're just a friend that's willing to
Yeah.
help out. And that just happened time and time again when I got started. And especially the first year, people just came alongside me and really helped elevate my podcast, helped it to do well. And so about a year in is really when actually, it was even before a year in, I was just thinking, you know what, somehow, some way, I want to do my best to help people that are in podcasting. Like if there's anything I can do, like never will I arrive. I will always be the student, but I'm a little further along than somebody who's like taking those first moves, right? Or just getting started, have their first 10 episodes out. And so I told my wife, I'm like, I'm devoted to helping podcasters. If I can find a way to do this, I'm going to. So almost immediately I started speaking at conferences and at that point traveling around. And now I've done a ton of virtual events as well. And along the way, I've just been asking people, how can I help? What are you struggling with? Is there something I can do? Is there someone I can introduce you to if I don't, if it's not me who can help? And I've just been really intentional with asking that because I want to serve the people that I care about. And that's like one of my number one core values in my life personally is just to take care of the people that I love and that I appreciate and build a community around it. So podcasting's been my space for that.
So where did that core value come from?
For me, everything stems from my faith. So I'm Christian. I follow Jesus, like read the Bible every day type of thing. Like that's what I've based my life upon. And when I look at that, maybe I'm not like a traditional Christian, if you will, but I look at the life of Jesus and he's someone who just lived to serve people. And so for me, I want to operate out of integrity. So everything I do be above board, like don't break the law, don't do bad things, right? And then just take care of people, love them where they're at, serve them however I can, and do my best in the space and the avenue that I'm in. Like I don't go out of my like sphere of influence, right? So like I'm not
Mm-hmm.
trying to go serve this random group over here because I don't know those people. I know podcasters. That's my community.
Yeah.
And so yeah, for me it all stems back to my faith and like I'm really driven by that. That's the most important thing in my life.
It's obvious for me and how for the interactions we've had since we've been friends and get to know each other that that's a quality that comes through very strongly to me from you, and I can definitely like for the benefit of the listener let them know that's exactly the vibe I get from you, that you just really
Cool.
like take pride in what you do, and you also come with that mindset to serve, which comes through pretty strongly as well.
Thanks, man. That means a lot. I mean, again, that being what I based my life on. If you would have been like, "Oh, I never noticed that," I've been like, maybe I need to change something. But no, your words right there, that means a lot. That really,
Yeah.
that's very encouraging. Thank you for saying that.
So you having these conversations, you're getting feedback as to what people need or what they're struggling with, right?
Yeah. So, what's interesting, going back to my show, like I learn a lot from my show. Like when I started, think about it, like I was in big corporate and I'm talking to young entrepreneurs just getting started in their own side hustle or business. So that's where I was when I was starting this podcast. So I was learning a lot. And I remember it was right before I went to a conference in Orlando, Florida. I talked to this guy named Dane Maxwell, and he has a book called Start from Zero.
Oh yeah.
And
He did the foundation.
the foundation. Oh, yeah,
That
yeah,
was
yeah. So,
his, yeah. I joined that
oh,
program
cool. Okay.
before
Nice.
I even became a podcaster, and I was doing my entrepreneurial, like, what am I going to do? I joined that was one of his first programs, the foundation. And yeah, because every time you say Dane Maxwell, I think of Dane Cook, the comedian. I'm
I
like, no,
know.
he's not.
No, no, it's a different guy. Thank you
But
for
I'm like, oh
clarifying.
yeah,
No.
Dane, yeah. Yeah, he's like the OG entrepreneurial coach, like from
Yeah.
back in the day.
He really is, and he's kind of the guy who learned to do it all very passive, right? Like he's very hands off with everything. When I interviewed him, he was just sitting in his studio playing his guitar. I'm like, "What are you doing today?" He's like, I don't think anything." I was like, "Oh no!" Like I think maybe he was a little bit depressed, but I don't know. At that,
That's
he
funny.
seems to be doing well now. He has a book out, and
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
he's just great at streamlining it. But nonetheless, the reason I brought that up is because I've always trusted a lot in my ideas. Coming in aerospace, like I seem to have a lot of good ideas for growing the company. But when it came to entrepreneurship and these side hustles and different things I wanted to do, not a lot of them really had merit. Like what I was trying to do, I was like, oh, okay, I'm 2 weeks into this and it's just not a good idea. And this one's a bad idea too. And his advice to me was stop trying to come up with ideas. He's like, they're not good. And I was like, that's interesting. He's like, instead, find the people you care most about, which that immediately spoke to me. I'm like, oh, that's like one of my core values. And he said, and find a problem that they have that in common that they have and make a solution for that. Come up with an idea based off the
Mm,
problem.
that's so
And that
good.
to me is like change the way I look at business altogether. Like when someone's like, Alex, you have a lot of good ideas. I'm always like, nah, I don't really. But if somebody I know has a problem, I can make an idea off of that. And so when I was at this conference in Orlando, I got off stage when I spoke, and whether you're a good or bad speaker, people line up to talk to you. It's just the way it goes. And I told my wife, I'm going to try to talk to as many people here as I can that are podcasters and ask them what they're struggling with. And the commonality I heard from throughout this whole thing, I talked to just over 100 people, and it was that I'm having trouble finding the right guests for my podcast. Not any guests, like their mom would be on the show, I'm sure, and their siblings, right? But they're like the right person that's going to speak to the audience that I'm trying to serve. And I came home with that, realizing, okay, I got these people's contact information. I was like, here's what people are saying. They're saying they're struggling with finding guests. What can we do? And it took me a little bit, it took me actually like a full week for it to like really hit me. But then I realized I'm like, oh, what if we did something like a Hinge or a Tinder, like an online dating app that connected guests and hosts together? Would that work? And that's really where the idea for my business came from. But it was just, again, going back to the point here, was serving the people and finding a solution to the problem that the people that I care about had.
Very cool. I love that story. When you were thinking about that, and did you know or you had a relationship with your co-founder? Can you tell a little bit about how you guys got connected?
Yeah, it's a good point because really it wouldn't have been where it is today without that. He's somebody that I knew for he was actually my wedding. Like at this point, it's almost 10 years ago that he was in my wedding. And we knew each other a few years before that even. And we worked together one time about 4 years beforehand. And we just did like a project together. And I'm more like the front facing like sales marketing guy, which I'm not great at those things, but like someone's got to do that side. But I kind of go with the vision and decide how we're going to get out to market. And he is a great developer, like incredible. The guy can do, I don't know how he does this. Like I can like write down something on a whiteboard and have it in my mind and he'll like create it and it
Nice.
works. So like I called him the same night I wiped, like when it hit me, I was like actually doing a kettlebell workout outside because at this point the world had shut down. So like outside,
Of course you were.
and right. So I just put down the kettlebell, ran inside, and I have 3 whiteboards in my office, and I just mapped this whole thing out. And then I immediately called him. I'm like, hey Jesse, we haven't worked together in a long time, but like we know we work well together. Would you want to do this? And crazy thing is that was a Tuesday. And on that Sunday, 2 days prior, he had just finished up a project. So he's like, yeah, I'm open. Like he had a full-time job still, but he's like me. He always has like some sort of side hustle. So we just drafted up something real basic and later on went and got a real attorney, but just like a 50-50 partnership. We both put $2,500 into an account and said, we're going to bootstrap this thing with $5,000 and see what happens. But having that relationship with him was really helpful, and him being ready to be on board, it was like
Hmm.
just perfect timing and worked out. When we hit the ground running that same night,
Yeah.
we both started working like that night.
That's the mindset. It seems like that's how you tackle
Yeah,
problems.
it seems like it. Yeah.
And so, how were those early days? Because what's interesting is it feels like you had the product market fit, which is really important when people talk about like entrepreneurial ideas and business and products to sell. So, I would imagine some of those people that you had early conversations with were some of the folks you started reaching out to.
Yeah. So, like, again, going back to that conference, I was getting those people's contact information. So when we launched, this was March 10th, 2020. And on June 15th, 2020, when we launched into early beta, we launched with those 100 people. Like, they were the people that test it for us. But our
Awesome.
whole goal before that was just to get like an MVP out. So minimal viable product, right? Like absolute bare bones. There was no logo. There was typos on the website. Like, it was rough,
Yeah.
but the idea, and we told them like, hey, this thing is free. There's no charge. You just tell us if it does what it's supposed to do, or if we're missing something, or if it's not interesting. Like, just tell us. And I learned a lot in those few months about developing a product, because one day I'd tell Jesse, hey, I got this idea. Here's what we should do. And the next day I'd be like, scratch that whole thing. Let's do this instead. I think this would be better. And he's like, dude, you don't understand how much work is involved in backtracking. He's like, we have to get this thing right.
Yeah.
And I made a ton of mistakes. It took us probably 8 months to correct along the way. And now I tell people this all the time. Like, next time I launch a SaaS business, a software as a service, it's going to be really great, because now I've like understand what you can and can't do. And same with Jesse. He understands what you can and can't do from that regard. But it was our first go at it. So our goal was just to get that thing to that MVP. Like, start ugly, doesn't have to look pretty. It just has to do something that people can test it and tell us, hey, are we in the right or wrong direction?
And Jesse's probably like, stop talking to Harry because every time you do,
Yeah. It seems like we would, yeah. So he and I we still meet together in person every Tuesday.
oh,
So
great.
he actually, when we started this business, he lived on the other side of Florida. So he lived on the other coast in like Destin, Florida. He sold his house, brought his family, there's 5 of them, over to Jacksonville, where I'm at. And then so we could work together at least once a week, because it just helps when you can whiteboard things out together, be in the same room. Like, sure, we live in a Zoom world, but nothing beats that like interaction. But yeah, I remember like every other Tuesday, it was like, hey, Harry gave me this 20 ideas. And finally he's like, who is this Harry guy? He's like, why does he know all this stuff? Like, but yeah, it was very helpful. It was part of our weekly list, if you will, was like, okay, here's a few items from Harry we need to get worked out. So, but like you referenced already, like, I'm intentional with that stuff. So I don't know if we would have ever talked again if I didn't take it, if I would have just been like, cool, thanks for the help, and then just scrapped whatever he gave
Yeah,
me.
that's
Like, I
true. Good
made a
point.
list. I remember it was 58 items the first time we talked. And I was going through, checking them off, getting them done. Some of them I even told you, like, this didn't make sense and this didn't make sense. But these 20, 30 things, these were right on the money for us. And I think that's probably why we initially even built a relationship, because you're like, oh, this guy isn't wasting my time. Like, he's doing something with what I'm telling him, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's exactly the feeling. Like it stood out. I think the way you tackled or just did a follow up, and the way you were like intentional about taking all the suggestions I made and just putting them into a cohesive plan. I think obviously speaks to the way you think, and also I think how you value relationships.
Yeah.
And when you get advice from people, like I get the sense that you treasure that.
Yeah. I really do. And one of the things that I'd say maybe I've struggled with, because I've done some coaching along the way, that's just kind of, I think it comes with being a podcast host, right? Like, people are going to ask you questions. And so I had this group of these 2 guys that were chatting with me for a while, and I gave them 30 minutes of my time, and I gave them some very easy things to do. Like, they needed a Calendly because they just were having trouble scheduling. Like, get a Calendly, attach something with like Stripe for invoicing right in there, so you don't have to worry about all this. Get your LLC, because they were just operating out of their personal bank accounts and stuff. I'm like, you all need to do this. And I remember like 3 months later, they came back to me and like, hey, we're still really struggling. I'm like, well, did Calendly work for you? Oh, we didn't do that. Do you guys have an LLC? No, we haven't had time to do that. And so like, I told them like, I can't meet with you all again, but you all can email me, because it was like one of those things that like, I didn't feel valued.
Yeah.
And so like, whenever I want people to feel the way I'd want to be treated and feel, right? So like, when somebody gives me advice, even if like, I've met some people that are brand new in podcasting that like know nothing, and they've given me advice, I'll still take it and see if it has merit. Like, I might not do it, right? But like, I'm at least going to write it down and say, you know what? Did what this person say bring a perspective that I've never thought about? Can I do something with this? Same with people that are really experienced. Like, I take everyone really seriously, because it's, again, the way I'd want to be treated. And I think being that student is going to serve you a lot better than ever pretending like you're some kind of master of something, right? So I always want to make sure that I have that side of the mindset, because I don't want to miss an opportunity to learn and improve myself for what I'm doing.
The golden rule, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Where did you pick this habit up, or where did you learn that? Or is that something that comes from like your core values?
For me, it comes from my core values, but I definitely didn't develop that until I was probably till I got married. I think my wife helped me grow up a lot. Sometimes I've told her a few times, I'm like, why did you marry me? Like I was such a kid I was 24, like when we got married. She was 26, I was 24. I'm like, I was like a child. But I think that she really just helped me develop those proper mindsets and things like that. She's like super gracious and very loving, and she kind of embodies a lot of these things. So I think I just saw it in her, and I was like, man, I would like to be more like that. Like I think that I should be more like that. And so I owe her a lot to the man that I've become in many ways. So that was very helpful for me along the way.
How important is it to have someone like that in your corner, especially going through all the things you went through? Because there's obviously something important when you're deciding to leave a steady, stable job and then trying on the entrepreneurial route. And then, speaking as an entrepreneur myself in a relationship, like understanding, like communicating good and bad days. So, how's that been helpful?
Yeah, when I told Alicia, that's her name, is my wife, when I told her that I was going to leave the aerospace job, I was like I was probably most nervous to tell her because I'd never had a conversation like that with her. Like we're very transparent. Communication, I'd say, is one of our strongest suits as a couple. But I was like, so I knew I was going to bring it up. And I was like, hey, I think I'm going to leave my job. And I'm like, I could see the immediate shock. And it just took her a few minutes. She's like, no, you know what? That makes sense. She's like, I support that. She's like, that's a good call. And like having that in my corner was really helpful. But even if you're not married, you don't have a spouse, a significant other, just getting yourself around friends that have a a mindset of abundance, I think is so,
Oh,
so
yeah.
important. I mean, having that in your corner, because that's ultimately what it is. Like Alicia has this mindset of abundance. There's always something to be learned. And now I have, at this point, like after I got married, my friends continuously improve. Some of them were people I knew beforehand as well. Like Jesse being one of them. They have just kind of grown up with me. But now when I surround myself with people, it's people that have abundance mindset. And I've got some friends who have literally watched lose like tens of thousands of dollars overnight from like a bad business decision. And they're still like, oh, it's fine. That just didn't work out. We'll try something else and keep on moving. And like seeing people with that mindset is like, oh my gosh, I guess anything is possible, right? Like
Yeah,
within
absolutely.
reason, of course, but like having that in your corner, I think is so important. It's actually helped me grow in my courage as an entrepreneur. Like I'm more willing to take risk, calculated risk, of course, but I'm more willing to take risk because the people in my corner, because they're like, oh, if it doesn't work, then you can try this, or maybe you'll learn something from it, right? So yeah, I mean, man, having those people, that type of person as a spouse or just friends in your corner, beyond important. I couldn't imagine, I wouldn't have made any of these decisions if I didn't have that already.
Yeah, this would be the time for my go-to reference to Jim Rohn. You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, and I feel like I could say that on every episode because it's
Yeah.
been so. It's the one thing that like when I first heard it and took it in, it really makes you take stock of like where you're at, and you just start to look around like the people that I'm with lifting me up or bringing me down, and where else can I look to be around people that inspire me to want to be a better person.
Yeah. I think some people take this out of context. When I first heard that quote, I was like, I like that. I'm like, how do I meet Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos? Like, like if I'm an average of the 5 people, I better get around these billionaires, right? That's not really what that means. It more so means like the mindset, who's like around you that you can really build those relationships with. But I mean, I love that quote. I firmly, firmly believe that, man. That's your inner circle, getting yourself around those right people and not pushing other people aside, but making sure that you have a little bit of a guard up. Like if you're hanging out with people that are getting super drunk and have like alcohol issues, right? Like 5 nights a week, you're probably going to become more like that. It doesn't
Yeah,
mean you can't be friends with those people, but
yeah.
you just have to have a boundary of saying, okay, this person can't be my inner circle. They can be a friend and an acquaintance, but I need to make sure the people I'm really spending time with and talking to, opening up to, are these people that I want to be more like. Again, they don't have to be millionaires or billionaires. They just have to be people that you can say, I could really learn something from this person. So I want to surround myself with them, which this, I'm preaching to the choir right now, but I love that
Yeah.
quote, man.
And it's one thing to just never lose sight of that. Like even there's lessons that I've learned years ago, and I think they're so important that I'm like, I don't want to forget that one. So I'm going to keep like reminding myself and keep talking about it because it's something that's important to continuously cultivate. So as you're starting to build it out, the PodMatch, and what feedback have you gotten in terms of like enhancements to the tool and to the extent that you can talk about anything that's coming up? What has you excited as you build that out?
Yeah. So when we first got started, like I said, I made a lot of guesses and told Jesse, like, oops, never mind. And some of the stuff, like, I just didn't know. Like, there was no way to really know certain things. So I did my best to seek some counsel and got some feedback. And some was good, some was bad. But basically when we launched on June 15th, we knew it wasn't going to be great. So we did the improvements people were asking for, but I'd say we had close to between 6 and 8 months of backtracking on certain pieces of it that I just
Hmm.
had the wrong idea on. Like I just didn't get it right. And now, thankfully, I can say this, like when we're recording this, we've now checked off everything aside from a very few minor things that we're working on right now that people have asked for. So when we built the roadmap, we didn't design it ourselves. We said, what's wrong with it? What could be better? And again, that's where we realized I was like, oops, sorry. Like I made some huge mistakes. I thought that people would want this, but they really wanted that. And I have to backtrack, which takes even more time. But anyway, long story short, here we are, like very close to a mature product. The last thing that we put on this list, which most companies do the opposite that we did, but UX has been the last thing. So user experience,
Yeah, yeah,
the actual look and feel of it, like even the colors, the font sizes, like I'll be real, I don't know anything about that stuff. Jesse knows even less about that stuff. So we now have plans where we're going to bring on a consultant who's actually like a UX, like we haven't found the person, but we're like working like
yeah, yeah.
to find the person that's going to be like a UX person that can actually do like the technical write-ups and stuff and say, here's your color codes, here's your font sizes, here's your fonts, here's what needs to be here, here's what people like this, right? So like all those things that we just don't know, but we purposely did that last because we asked people like, what needs to make this work for you? Like if the font size is 12 or 14 doesn't affect how good the product is for somebody, right? So,
Yeah.
but if we get complaints right now, it's actually around that. It's starting to become around that because everyone, and we regularly hear the product is great. Could you just make it prettier now? And, we live in a world people like the polish, especially when it comes to software. They want to click fast and they want it to move the way they like to move. So
Oh, yeah.
that's really our next big initiative is to very heavily dive into that UX side of things. But as far as the rest of it's concerned, we followed the roadmap along the way and just did our best to do that. And some of it was painful. Like there was a lot of work that went into it. And backtracking is not fun at all because it's just time that you,
Sure.
like for me, I'm like sitting there thinking we're going to take 3 months to do this and we could have just built it right up front,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
so it's tough. Like that mindset can be a little bit defeating at times. But yeah, man, that's kind of like where we're heading with this thing right now.
Very cool. Well, congrats on the progress you've made. I've
Thank you.
just even seen the growth in the time that I've been working with you. And it's something that definitely is needed in the industry, like the ability to have that marketplace for hosts and for guests to go. So we'll make sure we have links in the show notes so people can sign up. A couple questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Yeah, so something there's a lot. I feel like I change my mind on a lot of things all the time. I'm going to try to pinpoint something I think is really important, but I think that as it relates to maybe podcasting, I think that maybe chasing after bigger download numbers is important as some people make it seem.
Mm,
And I think the importance started off when I launched the podcast because certain people I wanted to have on, they said, well, how many downloads do you have? And like that being the initial question, like almost built this like mindset of, okay, I have to get my downloads, I have to get my downloads up. But I stopped focusing on that about 6 months ago,
yeah.
mainly because PodMatch got really busy. So I was like,
Yeah.
got to choose where my time's at. But
Yeah.
and then I realized like the feedback I was getting on my podcast was still just as powerful and just as great. So I kind of took on this shifted mindset of downloads don't really matter as much as impact that I'm having on one person's life who really needs it this week, right? And some people really don't agree with that and they say it always needs to be growing and stuff. And I guess my show probably grows pretty slow. I'm not like looking at the stats every week, but I'm more focused on can I continue to produce something that's going to really help and serve the person who needs it most right now? And that's kind of been a big shift for me. And it actually took a lot of pressure off because at first I was like, oh, I only had like a 4% growth this month instead of 10, like I wanted, right? Like, and that
Yeah.
would bring stress. And now I'm more like, you know what? If somebody listens and it impacts them, I hear from it. That's huge. I love that. So that's a mindset shift that I've had really recently.
That's a good one because it's something that podcasters need to hear early on. Because even as clients, they come to me and they're like, "We want tons of downloads," and my first response is, "Why?" And they're
Right.
like, "Because of sponsorships." And I'm like, "Have you done the math? Like, it's if you get 10,000 downloads, and let's say you get a $30 CPM, which is high, you're getting $30 per thousand downloads. So 10,000 means you're getting $300 per episode. And let's say you have a monthly show, monthly with weekly episodes, you're making $1,200 on your podcast. I don't think anyone's going to be, you know, leaving their job for 1,200 bucks a month and 10,000 downloads is a lot. That would be
Yeah.
amazing for
It's
almost.
more than
I
the
think
top
that
one.
yeah.
That puts you in the top less than 1%,
Yeah,
right?
that 1%. But it's so I always have them think about either sponsorship or develop that connection for a different reason. And even network building, like I always say, you could start a podcast, invite 20 people you want to have a relationship with. And even if you got 0 downloads, those 20 conversations would be worth their weight in gold.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, I took the advertisements out of my podcast. So
Mm.
when I decided to stop focusing on this side, I had like a few call to actions and things like that. I took all that away and I talk about PodMatch. It comes up in almost every
Oh, yeah, of
episode.
course.
Like
That's so smart.
organically, it comes
Yeah.
up. Like I'm not like, oh, and by the way, PodMatch, like everybody, but it comes up really organic. And sometimes my guests bring it up because they're aware of it as well. And that's actually converted really well for me. But it's me leading with value. I'm not telling people not to have advertisements, but for me, it just kind of helps reinforce the perspective that I have about my show right now.
That's so smart. And then I tell clients that I work with is always have like your thing as the first sponsor of your show. What's
Yeah.
interesting is what that does is it lets listeners know, it's a subtle hint that says, oh, by the way, this show that you like and that you listen to on a regular basis has an ad spot. So if you're a
Yeah.
business owner and you're listening, you're like, oh, I like the show. I'd like to hear my business advertised on this show. So it's a good practice, and it's good for the host too to get into the habit.
Right.
This episode's brought to you by just learn how to do those reads so that when you do get the opportunity, you're ready for it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that practice is so valuable because I've heard some ads that the hosts read that are really bad. And it's probably because I don't say it to be mean, but they're new at it, right? Like it was probably their first time doing that.
Yeah,
But if you
yeah,
have some practice with that, some people that do like Jordan Harbinger, he's
yeah,
somebody his ads, like I don't want a new bed, but the way he sells it, I'm like, dude, maybe I do want a new bed, but like he's just polished with it.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's because he
yeah.
has experience. He's done it so many times at
Sure.
this point, gotten all the reps in. So for somebody who's new, yeah, like start off with yourself, like be your own test subject, right? Eventually you'll have that real polished sound that people are like, dang, whatever this guy's talking about, I want it. So yeah, I like
Yeah.
that you brought that up. That's important.
It comes with time and it comes
Yeah.
with reps as well. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
I think that it's actually that I'm a really nice person, which sounds weird, but like I do a lot of cold outreach right now to
Yeah.
people in podcasting to talk about PodMatch and things like that, or just to collaborate. And I write personal emails and they're very nice. Like I'll be real, my emails are really nice. Some people think they're fake. And I definitely don't mean for it. I've been cussed out more times than you can imagine after sending like, hey, and like I come from integrity. So if I listen to your podcast, hey, I really enjoyed your podcast, listen to this episode.
Yeah.
I keep it really brief to make sure it doesn't sound like, because there's a lot of spam out there. So I keep it really brief. I'm just like, really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for doing that. Would love to have a conversation with you about what I'm doing, see if there's any room to collaborate. Something like that. And thanks so
Sure,
much.
sure.
No pressure or anything like that. If people will write back and they're like, F you, dude, like get out of here. And then some of those people, I'll be like, hey, so sorry, I didn't mean to bother you, my bad. And sometimes they'll come around and be like, wait, can we talk on the phone? Like, I wasn't sure if you were real. We'll get on the phone. They're like, dang, you are so nice. Like, are you really like this? And so like, it sounds weird, but people misunderstand the fact that like, I'm coming out of a genuine spot of like, I care and I definitely want to help. Some people just think maybe it's fake or I'm trying to scam people. I'm working on that, like how I can not come across that way. Cause maybe my corporate background, like hurt me from like writing good emails. I don't know, because they
Yeah,
were like
yeah. That's
really
right.
like straight to the point, big
Oh, yeah,
words,
yeah, yeah. That's right.
like so I'm constantly unwiring that mess that maybe I have internally. But yeah, I
Like
could
a robot trying to be polite. I am
right.
sorry for your mistake.
Yeah, it's kind of how it, I will admit, like if I look back at like a year when I was talking about creating a brand, getting people to listen to it, a lot worse. Like I've gotten better and better over time. But yeah, I still have a little bit of way to go. But I think some people realize, like people think that maybe I'm being fake, but really I am a person who cares. Like I believe I'm a really kind individual.
Well, that's definitely something that I agree with, and it comes across in everything that you do in terms of the interactions we've had. How you've tackled this project now of building PodMatch, and how you're leading with integrity there. So I think all good things to come. I'm sure. I imagine it's been a pretty wild ride for you, but I'm so happy you were able to come on and share your story. We covered a wide variety of topics, which I always
Yeah.
love.
Yeah. No, Harry, I love this podcast. I mean, Podcast Junkies is great. I've known about it since I got started. Somebody showed it to me like, I mean, you have like almost 300 episodes or something
Yeah.
like that at this point. And yeah, someone showed me it right away. So I've been around for a while, love what you do. Honestly, it's like kind of a bucket list thing, even being here with you today. So I really appreciate it, man.
Well, thanks again, Alex. And we'll make sure all the stuff you listed out will be provided in the show notes. And where's the best place for folks to connect with you?
Yeah, so if you're interested in PodMatch, what we just talked about, Harry will have a link for you to that. And then creatingabrand.com is my show if you're interested in checking that out. I know we talked about it a little bit as well. So that's just creatingabrand.com. You can find everything that I'm involved with there.
Thanks again, Alex. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it, Harry. Thank you.
Thanks again to Alex for coming on the show. Really enjoyed that heartfelt conversation with him and grateful for getting to know him a little bit better as a friend. Full show notes at podcastjunkies.com/261. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Don't forget to check out our longtime super supporter of the show, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Scarlett 2i2 Pro podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Sign up for a free podcast brainstorm at fullcast.co/chat15. Tune in next week for my conversation with Craig Hewitt, founder of Castos and host of Seeking Scale. And if you made it this far, you're no doubt looking for this retention hashtag of the week. Let's go with Brand Alex, BRANDALEX. Tag us at podcast_junkies and Alex at Alex J Sanfilippo. So that's ALEXJSANFILIPPO. As always, thanks for all you do to support this show. And if you're looking for an additional way to spread the word, tell at least one new friend about the show and how much you're enjoying it. I appreciate everything you do. Talk to you next week.